Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Remember C10, that controversial bill the Trudeau Liberals introduced, which sought to give the Canadian government power to monitor and censor communications on social media platforms, making them the arbiters of what is offensive and what isn't, what is true and what is false. Well, that bill died as the Senate adjourned for the summer, and then, of course, we were in the midst of a federal election. Not to worry, the new, yet at the same time old, federal government has reintroduced the bill, this time as C11. Yes, Bill C11, the Online Streaming Act as it's called, still gives critics, though, cause for concern. Some claim Bill C11 is an infringement on our charter rights and that Canadian communications will be in a dark, Big Brother-esque world if this bill passes. Well, joining us now to help us address these concerns is Michelle Simard, Senior Legal Counsel and Privacy Officer, and Kanisha Clarke, an independent management consultant. Michelle and Kanisha, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yes, so I feel like we just had this discussion a year ago, but yet here we are. So Michelle, perhaps you can start us off. How is C11 different than its old version, C10?
So what the government did was they heard the complaints from last year. They heard the uproar, and all they did was, clawed back a certain amount of things. So before the major, if you have to label it in a nice category, I would say that the biggest difference is now that amateurs are not going to be regulated by the CRTC, which it was the biggest uproar that everybody had, because it was like, how can you or I or like a mother put something online and then all of a sudden now it's going to be, subject to the CRTC. So I think in that respect, they clawed that back, and I would say that would be the biggest difference. But a lot of the other stuff is still very similar. They just put nice, fluffy language to soften it up a bit. Yeah.
So did you feel they had to claw that back? Was there enough of an uproar? Because this did pass the House and it was going through the Senate. Was there hesitation in the Senate? Did they have a sense that it might fail if they don't amend this clause? Michelle, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's tough to say because we're not there, but I personally think that, yes, I think there might have been some issues on the Senate because sometimes legislators don't realize the gravity of some of the things they're proposing. Because it's hard when sometimes you're in a different, I would call it the bubble, right? You're looking at so many different things. You're checkboxing, you have a checklist and you're putting all the check marks saying, okay. But then you don't realize, oh my God, there's this other aspect that didn't even contemplate that would have went there, right? I mean, to give you a good example, think about when back in the day when parents used to take pictures of their kids at school, okay? Mm-hmm. And they share it with other parents and say, in those pictures, they would have people's other kids in those pictures, and they would show them without realizing that that's privacy rights there. Maybe some other parent doesn't want it, or sometimes a school would post a picture of children in the playground and put it on their newsletter, again, for everybody to see without getting consent. So the world's a little different now with the online world. And so now I think that's what happened with legislators. I don't think it was anything negative or malicious. I think it's something that they just didn't think about. And until the people who are experts in it came and said, hey, hold on a second. Do you understand exactly what you're doing? When you do this, you are going to allow the floodgates to open. Right. And now everybody's regulated. Everybody should not be regulated. Frankly.
Now, go ahead.
I honestly don't know how, even if that did pass for some whatever reason it happened, how could they possibly enforce it would be stunning to me. They don't have the infrastructure to do it. So I think in that respect, they needed the critics to point those things out.
Okay, and I have a big question for you, Kanisha, and we can start it now, but I can see we only have 45 seconds to commercial. But some are arguing that Bill 10 or Bill 11, similar to its predecessor, Bill 10, was not about free speech or censorship, but it's about promoting Canadian content and forcing online streaming companies such as Netflix to follow the same broadcasting regulations that, hey, all of us networks have to follow. Is that your takeaway? We have about 15 seconds, and I'll pick it up with you again after commercial.
Well, I think, to look at it from the user standpoint, there's algorithms, And there are things that, they need to think about. Now, when you have a platform such as YouTube, they sometimes enforce certain things where they can pick up, like if a user has been, predict behaviors and stuff like that,
Okay,
and then
Kanisha,
recommend
I've got to
videos.
pause you there. We're going to pick this up in just a few moments. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're discussing the new bill C11, which is a version of its predecessor C10 that was introduced federally this past March. And joining me again is Michelle Simard and Kanisha Clarke. Kanisha, before commercial, we ran out of time. My apologies, but we'll pick it right back up. There have been discussions that some are suggesting that this is really about promoting online content, more Canadian content, just like we do with major network carriers like Rogers, like Bell, like TELUS, that kind of thing. What do you make of these claims that this kind of bill would force companies like Netflix to carry more Canadian content?
So I believe that their aim in modernization is to make sure that they can include how we're evolving in technology, which I think is a really good thing. However, if you're not quite understanding how these different platforms use their technology to better the user experience, to provide a platform where people can feel like they can speak freely, where they can make money, and there's a lot of different things, compensation models with these different various platforms. So a large number of those content creators sit there and they make content that maybe a certain audience wants to listen to. So as a user is listening to these different content creators, YouTube has like algorithms and sensors that predict certain behaviors, and they pick up similar or like content that you may be interested in. And this is very, very important. So if this is how people are starting to make money and they see an avenue for themselves, it's very difficult to say that there might not be any censorship there, or there might not be a cause for concern. Of course, there's going to be cause for concern. I feel strongly that this bill may actually have a lot of backlash from content creators where they are generating income and profits from what they're doing. So I do believe that there's one set to look at how those companies that you're regulating, and then two, the user experience those content creators are being impacted. And then even three, is it healthy for competition? So I definitely see why there would be cause for concern and why people might believe that it is censorship and maybe even causing freedom of speech to be kind of
right, to be eroded, basically.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so one of those clauses that was very controversial in terms of something being removed and then re-added was Section 4.1. And Michelle, I'm going to ask this to you. You're a lawyer. You can digest this for me. In Bill C10, it was removed, but in this new C11, it is back. And you alluded to this in your first question when I threw that to you. So what happened? The government, you said they just basically smartened up and said, you know what, we've got to put this back in. There was too much backlash, or is there something else at play here?
Oh, I think the problem was that...
And maybe explain what 4.1 was.
Yeah, so, okay, so like everything in life, right? Like you come up with an idea and you're like, okay, you know what, I'm going to make this dinner tonight. And then, okay, that's great. But what are the ingredients, right? Like you need specifics. And I think that what happened was it was just too much gray. And so it was about broadcaster, what is considered a broadcaster. And so putting this back in, it was about giving a little bit of a definition or like guideline of what would be constituted. So therefore, if you didn't qualify as a broadcaster or professional, then you wouldn't be mandated by this. Mm-hmm. And anyone else who wasn't mandated by this, you're considered amateur, right? It's kind of like when you think about the Olympics. People who go to the Olympics are considered to be amateurs. Once you're professional, then, you don't go to the Olympics anymore because you're a professional. This is for amateurs to compete. And so at the end of the day, they were kind of giving this breakdown. But as Kanisha was explaining when she was talking about the algorithms and so forth is, okay, so great. Now you've made a little bit of revenue. Now you might get picked up by another, streaming service, or it could be a broadcasting service. Now, what happens there? And you might be making some money out of it. It could be peanuts, for God's sakes, but it still qualifies as some form of compensation, consideration, and whatever. That qualify you now as being a broadcaster. And I think this is what the issues are. They brought it back because they realized in some ways, so they cleaned up the language a bit to try to make it better. But I still don't think it's tight. It's not tight. I think that And I get for legislation, it's very hard to get so nitty gritty and fine tooth it. But on this particular one, I think they needed to.
Okay, so this reinsertion of the clause, so essentially the CRTC will be the ones determining who's a broadcaster, or is it the government agency? It would be the CRTC, I assume.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So regulate and who they can't regulate, and they have a certain system. But again, let's go let's pull a layer back here, and let's think about. So great. So it's a CRTC. Who in the CRTC is doing it? Is this a low-level employee? Is it a mid-level employee? Is it a high-level employee?
Is it even a committee? Is it a delegation? We don't know. But I do know that we have to cut to commercial break. So I'll be right back with you, Michelle, in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're discussing the new Bill C11 at the federal government, and joining me is Michelle Simard and Kanisha Clarke. Michelle, just before we had to cut to commercial break, we're discussing who is the arbiter of what a broadcaster is. And I know it's really under the responsibility of the CRTC. But it's sort of one of those things as like, who gets to determine information and misinformation and disinformation? Who are these people really? Is it going to be a committee? Is it just one person? Do we have any insight into this, Michelle?
No. And I think it's likely because the bill hasn't been passed yet. And so until it's passed, I mean, to use taxpayer resources to start determining in like a model that would be employed to do this it's just not feasible. We don't have that kind of I guess taxpayer funded resources to figure those things out. So essentially it's play as you go. It gets passed, they'll then be the person, the I guess the organization that determines it. But again, this goes back to some of the other issues that I, discussed with you on some other programs, where it's just like, okay, that's great when you deal with, privacy issues and so forth, but it goes down to the nitty gritty. Who are the actual people doing it? Is it low level, mid, high level? Are these people properly educated? Is there a proper model and checklist that they follow to determine this? And is there a mechanism to appeal that decision?
May I chime in?
All in the dark.
May I chime in there?
Yeah, please go ahead, Kanisha.
So I think before they even made that decision, they need to understand how the platforms are used and how Netflix or YouTube are actually generating user content. What's the user experience? How do they actually put together these algorithms? There's a lot of issues around privacy and consent and confidentiality. All these things are things that we should be thinking about. So if you don't understand the lay of the land, it's kind of difficult for you to have regulation that you're saying, yeah, we're going to just decide who does what. And you do not understand that. So I think they're way ahead of themselves in terms of just starting to regulate an area maybe that they're not so sure of how the technology works and how it may play out and how it may actually constrain certain people that actually use the platform to generate money. And that could cause for concern, like you're saying, around probably charter rights and things of that nature.
Right, because I mean, who are these people? They're the YouTubers, they're the TikTokers, the podcasters. I mean, Kanisha, these are the folks who put out their content and I don't think they determine themselves as being broadcasters. They're just there putting out some thoughts and ideas, maybe making a few dollars out of it. So I guess I will say that how will this bill impact those amateurs, Kanisha, in your opinion?
Well, like Michelle said, they do have something where they're, like you said, you're going to a kitchen. What are the ingredients? And again, it starts off by understanding how the platform is used and how that company actually uses it. So those users, like what Michelle was saying was, oh, no, not the mom and pops or the people that are just, but they could be lumped in if they have certain brand deals. And what we call brand deals are sponsorship deals with certain people to produce certain content. Because they're supposed to be creatives, they figure out a way to market this to their audience. And that helps them to grow their audience.
Right.
So from a business standpoint, you're cutting into a lot of money, right? So they can have users largely that are just not Canadian. They're in China, who for all we know, right? Or they could be in the US and they're in largely
sunny Florida.
Right. Like, I'm not wherever they are, right? Like whatever platform they're using. And I'm just saying any country. Okay. If that's where your global, most of your subscribers are, then yeah, I'm going to be like, well, this is going to cut into my money now that I have to have content possibly that should be of Canadian heritage. But I want to go a step further. The basis of it, them using CanCon as the requirements. Like,
and what is CanCon for our viewers?
Oh, it's like the place where they're going to be talking about our Canadian heritage and how they build criteria.
Our Canadian content.
Yes, of what is considered Canadian content. So if they're going to use those specific requirements to say, okay, this is what Canadian heritage is, this is what we're classifying as Canadian content, those people are going to have more educated people behind them, helping them to figure out, one, what is considered Canadian content? And if they were to upload that and all of a sudden they're like, oh, they're reported, how do we do that? Like, how does somebody even defend themselves for saying, I'm not, like, what do you mean it's not? Like, how am I, you know what I mean? So there's just so much awareness that needs to, or education that needs to still be rolled out before we decide this type of thing. It's going too fast.
Well, and that you bring up a good point, Kanisha, is that, you know, until we know how these platforms work, until we know what model will be used to assess content, Canadian content, whether someone's a broadcaster or not, how does a member of parliament vote on this? If they don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, how can one actually make an educated vote on this? We're going to pick this discussion up in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're having our discussion on Bill C11, the new version of Bill C10 that will sort of regulate what you can and cannot listen to online on the internet. Joining me again is Michelle Simard and Kanisha Clarke. Kanisha, you know, as a consumer of online media, I suppose, where, you know, you listen to your podcasters, your YouTubers and that sort of thing, how is this bill, if it's passed, going to impact my choice as a subscriber, maybe to a YouTube channel? Are you telling me the government's going to control what I can and cannot view on the internet going forward?
Well, they're going to impact what you can see, right? So I don't know if there's going to be a limitation of that, but I definitely know that they're going to add something to that. So it should be more Canadian or Canadian heritage or Canadian content, right? So yes, you will be impacted. And how they roll that out or what type of information is provided to them to, I guess, evaluate certain broadcasters, that's still up for debate, right? So it's really hard to say who is going to be impacted, but largely every one of us will be impacted that use the platform for viewership. The ones that are actually creating content, definitely. And then definitely, you know, Netflix, YouTube, Facebook. And you know what really concerns me is let me just go back. What concerns me is the fact that we have an integrated platform with Facebook, Meta, Instagram, and WhatsApp. They're allowed to use, and they let users know that they're going to be using their data to better the service and to possibly give them content that they like or it's recommended to them. And that's how these platforms work. So it's really interesting to me how the government is going to evaluate or measure whether they're giving Canadian content and stuff like that. So it's still very tricky.
Yes, well, there's still a lot to be worked out. But, you know, if we bring this to more of a higher level discussion in terms of our charter rights, Michelle, do you feel there are sections or that Bill C11 in general infringes on our charter rights?
So this is the problem that I sometimes have with a lot of legislations, right? Like sometimes they're not clear, like we discussed, a little bit of grayness, and that grayness needs to be actually flushed out, because sometimes the application of the bill in theory and word doesn't necessarily infringe, but then when it's applied, it does have an infringement, right? Right. And so right now, it's possible there could be some infringement. Will there be an infringement? I'm not sure. It's going to be how it actually is applied, how the CRT mandates it. And so I think at that point, I mean, if you think about it right now, there is no group right now that says they're going to sue the government because they feel that this is a violation of charter rights, because everybody knows the only way we can really determine it's a violation is once it's applied. Right. So do it possible. And then even if it is a charter violation, is it demonstrably justified? Right. Because our charter allows us to actually infringe on some of our rights so long as we can demonstrably justify it. in a free and democratic society, right? And so at the end of the day, there's tests that have to be done. I do remember, though, that the government did want to have a legal review done to see if there was a charter infringement. And right now, as it stands, there isn't. But personally, because we discussed and what Kanisha was just talking about prior to the break when we were talking about CanCon. CanCon is very particular on what constitutes Canadian content or not. So for instance, The Handmaid's Tale, as we all know from Margaret Atwood,
Right.
This is based on her book. 100% Canadian, right?
Right, it's filmed in Canada.
Yeah, but the show in and of itself, and Margaret Atwood had a lot to do with the show, right? To make sure like it stayed true to her story, but it's not considered Canadian content. And then a show like The Tudors about British monarchy, because how it was produced and how it was filmed, is considered CanCon, even though it has nothing to do with talking about Canadian heritage or culture or anything like this. And so the rules of what's considered Canadian content or not, again, they're rigid. It was based on something that this was enacted in the 1970s and 80s, and it needs to be updated for the modern world and the online world. And so do I think there could be charter challenges? I absolutely think there'll be. What they are, the world's your oyster right now, because it really is depending on it.
Okay, well, ladies, thank you both so much. I appreciate you shedding some light onto this issue, and we'll have to have you back on soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So does Bill C11 violate our charter rights? Well, I guess time will tell. We have to wait for it to be passed, and it probably will be soon before we can apply any legal analysis. One thing I'd like to leave you with is this question. Do we really need the government regulating what our interaction is online and with all our online platforms? For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.